So now we go to the next big area of our tour of the Lizzie Borden Axe Murder House. And that is the John Morse Room, or as it's come to be known by tourists and just about everybody associated with this house, as the Murder Room. So what's important to know about this room, and the reason it's become one of the most sought after locations in this part of the country and in this house for overnight stays for tourists, is because the matriarch of the family, Mrs. Borden, was actually murdered in this house. And she was murdered in a pretty grotesque way. And it was pretty shocking at this time. This was the 1890s. It was well before, the time of what we have today with all these high profile serial killer cases like Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy and all that kind of stuff that we typically see in the news. She was murdered in a very grotesque fashion. And in addition to that, there is actually a crime scene photograph, which is the first crime scene photograph in United States history that was, of course, made public and seen by the public. And so if we were to take a look at this picture, we can see Mrs. Borden was murdered in a very grotesque fashion. We can see her lying face down on the floor. Another thing that's interesting is if you look up at the mirror, you can actually see the camera that was used to take the picture. That's pretty interesting as well. But as you can see, she was murdered in a pretty grotesque fashion. So what they saw about her body was that she had one very significant wound right to the top of her head, right the side of her head, right above her ear, which is, of course, done with an axe. She had another really big wound right in between her shoulder blades. That was a significant injury as well. The rest of her injuries were mostly to the back of her head and to her neck. Very gruesome fashion. In total, she was actually hit with an axe a total of 19 times. So you can imagine this was a very painful death, and it made quite a mess in this room as well. And of course, because there was a gruesome murder here, and whenever there's a gruesome murder, the general understanding is that this room has become haunted by the ghost of Mrs. Borden. And because of that reason, guests will come to stay in this room in the hopes that they will have an experience with the apparition of Mrs. Borden. Another reason why that may be the case is because probably her spirit is a little bit unsettled, and unsettled for the reason that the killer of Mrs. Borden was actually never convicted of the crime. That's right, there was never a conviction in this case. The chief suspect in the case, of course, famously, was actually Lizzie Borden. And she was actually put on trial for the case in 1890s, but she was eventually acquitted and not found guilty in 1892 due to insufficient evidence. The reason most people would associate her as the killer and would understand her as one of the first recorded female serial killers in American history, maybe not serial killer, but axe murderer would probably be the closer understanding. But the reason that they would put her in that category is because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that would point to her. As a matter of fact, she was the only person in the house that we know of at this time. She was the last person to see Mrs. Borden alive. She was actually in the house. As she said, her alibi was that she was downstairs in the house folding handkerchiefs. And the last time she spoke to her mother would have been around 9 a.m. And from the autopsy that was done, we know that she expired somewhere around 9:30 a.m. And nobody else was in the house. This was her Uncle John's room, and he was not here at this time. Neither was Mr. Borden. He was out at the river, and Lizzie's sister Emma was away as well. So this would only leave Lizzie and her mother in the house at this time. A lot of that evidence would point to her being the killer. But of course, the court did not convict her, so it doesn't really matter from that standpoint. But yeah, you can see that this is very significant. Again, first crime scene photograph in American history. So really take a look at that and take that in because that's history. But, since then, since that time period, of course, this house has become a museum, and this room has now become, a tourist destination. And it's believed to be haunted. And so while we're here, we'll keep a lookout for the spirit of Mrs. Borden, and we'll see if she has anything to say to us. Maybe she can identify who her killer was, and maybe we'll start to learn a little bit more about that.